Wonderful to be here waiting for the PowerPoint to warm up. What I am going to do is tell you why climate change is actually a double-edged sword when we talk about water in California. Climate change will both reduce the availability of fresh water and increase flooding from sea level rise. But first, a word of warning. I am not a scientist. I'm a consultant, and this is my business plan. My comments are my own personal opinions. They do not represent the views of any of my clients, any government agency, business, or other organization. Also, my wife asked me to tell you that she seldom, if ever, agrees with me. And my daughter is typically embarrassed by everything I said. So, with that out of the way, let's move on. Tony, can you fill the lights up here so that we're looking at the screen and not me? You all know that we are in the 4th year of a drought in California. And we've had droughts before, so it's not certain whether climate change is the primary cause of our current one. But climate change is bringing us higher temperatures, which, when combined with drought, will spawn more wildfires in more places. California's wildfire season already extends nearly year-round. California relies on a massive plumbing system to move the water from where it falls as rain and snow, which is mostly in the northern and the eastern parts of the state, to where most of the people live, which is along the coast and in Southern California. And as we've learned earlier today, much of this water is stored in the form of snow in the Sierra Nevada. As the snow melts in the spring, the runoff is stored in reservoirs. It's released for use during the dry summer and fall months. Our statewide water system, let me see, I popped ahead. Much of the water is stored in, as I said, in reservoirs. And while it seems likely that the amount of precipitation that we will receive in California won't change much, most of it will fall as rain and less as snow. So we will lose the Sierra snowpack as our big free reservoir. And our existing statewide water delivery system won't work without that free reservoir. So we're moving towards something called integrated regional water management plans, which means that all of us and every region is going to have to come up with its own most effective way to collect, store, conserve, and recycle the water in each region. Now, as global temperatures have continued to rise, the water mass in the world's ocean has expanded, glaciers have melted, ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica are sliding into the sea. And the result has been a gradual increase in sea level. Over the past century, the waters just offshore here in San Francisco Bay, on average, have gone up over 7 inches. We know this because the longest continuously operating tide gauge in the entire United States of America is at the Golden Gate. And the scientists tell us that water levels worldwide will rise even faster in the future. The exact level, if you want to make money, find some scientist to tell you exactly how high the sea level will be at a particular date in the future, and bet against it. Because nobody really knows, because we don't know how we'll be producing our energy. But what this graph shows is that by the end of this current century, the water level could rise between 23 and 55 inches. And whatever the precise increase turns out to be, sea level rise is inevitable, and it is unstoppable because of the greenhouse gases that are already in our atmosphere. So even if we shut off all the lights, park all the cars, mothball all the power plants everywhere on the face of the earth right now, sea level will continue to rise for centuries. Now, this doesn't mean that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is useless. Even if we can't stop rising sea level, we can slow the increase. And the most simple, fastest, and most elegant way of accomplishing this is through a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Rising sea level is going to have a profound impact on the California coastline, on San Francisco Bay, and on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. San Francisco Bay is going to be at the epicenter of these impacts. There was an analysis done by the Pacific Institute. They looked at the entire coast from Oregon to Mexico and all around San Francisco Bay, and they concluded that $100 billion worth of assets are vulnerable to flooding. The lion's share, almost 63%, is in the Bay Area. Now, to understand why sea level rise will have such an impact on the Bay Area, we need to take a look at the past. The aerial photograph on the left shows us what San Francisco Bay looks like today. On the right is a map showing the extent of wetlands around the bay about the time of the 1849 gold rush. You see the bay was quite a bit bigger. But much of the bay was shallow. 2/3 of it was less than 12 feet deep. So between 1850 and 1960, 1/3 of that wet area was filled, diked off, or reclaimed for real estate development. State legislation was passed in 1965 to stop the continued wholesale destruction of the bay. But the damage of the past remains. Today, the bay is surrounded by 240 square miles of filled land. Land that was filled just high enough to get it above sea level of the past. So this legacy of filling the bay in the past is a great predictor of what sea level rise could do in the future. Here's two maps. One shows the extent of the water area in 1849, the other what the bay could look like in 2100 with sea level rise. You see, they're pretty much the same. So at first blush, this is great news. You know, all that area that we destroyed over the past century and a half will become part of our beautiful bay in the future. The bad news is we have built all kinds of expensive stuff on that low-lying real estate, including stuff that is simply essential to civilization as we know it. Let me show you a couple other examples. This is San Francisco International Airport. Its vulnerability to 16 inches and 55 inches of sea level rise. I've had people look at this and say, I get it. Fly Oakland. This is Oakland International Airport. And another Bay Area icon that's essential to civilization is Silicon Valley, which faces double jeopardy. Silicon Valley used to be called the Valley of Heart's Delight. It was fruit orchards, and those fruit orchards were irrigated with well water. And as the water was withdrawn, the ground elevation sank, so that much of the South Bay shoreline is below current sea level. What this map shows is some of the high-tech companies that are located in this low-lying area. If nothing else, this map shows that aquatic wildlife and geeks seem to prefer the same habitat. Now, why doesn't the area flood now? Well, it's because the shoreline of the bay, which it appears to be, don't mess that upside down, it's separated from the open bay by this mosaic of ponds that were used for salt production. But the levees between the ponds weren't designed or built to provide flood protection. In fact, an old colleague of Mary and mine, Steve Ritchie, who is an engineer, looked at those and he said, those aren't levees, those are heaps of dirt. But typically there's more than one and often several ponds between the bay and the shoreline. So the multiple series of piles of dirt provides some level of protection. But even so, on today, tomorrow, any dry, sunny day, Silicon Valley could be flooded if an earthquake melts those heaps of dirt into pools of mud. Around the bay, there are highways, rail lines, airports, businesses. The homes of over 250,000 people are located in this low-lying area. The replacement value alone of these valuable assets is over $60 billion. So what's the Bay Area doing about sea level rise? Well, most people, I think, view climate change as an environmental problem. I believe that adapting to sea level rise is an economic imperative. And the major businesses in the Bay Area understand that the Bay Area is in competition with the rest of the world to attract investment capital to our region. Yet some of our most valuable property is vulnerable to flooding. And insurers will abandon us if they believe our flood risks are too high. And we can't expect international capital to continue to flow to the region if we don't recognize the reality of sea level rise and develop a coherent regional strategy for dealing with it. Other regions around the world that we're competing with are already formulating their strategies. Rotterdam, which is already the largest port in Europe, dreams of becoming Europe's Silicon Valley by climate-proofing their city. Well, hell, we already have the world's Silicon Valley here. We can't afford to lose it, either to Europe or to sea level rise. To win this competitive battle, government agencies in the Bay Area are working with business organizations, labor, environmental groups, social justice advocates, other stakeholders, and anybody who will talk to us to create a coherent regional strategy for dealing with sea level rise. And our flood preparedness planning is being coordinated with our planning for other disasters. But we also recognize that rising sea level is fundamentally different from other disasters. When we prepare for fires, floods, earthquakes, we work to reduce the likelihood that they'll happen at all. We try to minimize their destruction when they do occur, and then we move to return to normal as quickly as we can. But rising sea level is a disaster that can't be prevented, and it won't stop until all the ice stops melting. It's like an earthquake that never stops, but continues to shake more. It's like a fire that keeps burning and getting hotter. What is now dry land will become water, and the water will keep getting deeper, and the shoreline will move inland and upland for as long into the future as we can imagine. Now, geological records show that the level of the sea has gone up and down hundreds of feet as global temperatures have gone up and down. When the temperature goes down, the water freezes, and we have an ice age. When the temperature goes up, the ice melts, and the sea level goes up. But for the past 6,000 years or so, from when I was very small, the Earth's climate has been pretty stable, and it's been pretty warm. And interestingly, this roughly coincides with a period when human civilization is developing. So as a civilized species, we have learned that the shoreline is where the shoreline always was. And therefore, we humans believe that the shoreline will always be where it is because that's always where it's been. And we have developed all sorts of cultural, legal, regulatory rules and customs around the notion that the location of the shoreline is a fixed line on the face of the earth. Our species has never had to deal with the idea that sea level changes or that the shoreline can move inland. Now suddenly, our human experience has become irrelevant. From this point forward into the future, the location of the shoreline will always be permanently temporary. Now this is a hard concept to grasp. We'll have to find new ways to plan, to develop, to enjoy, to make productive use of our immediate shoreline in a manner that will accommodate and adapt to the fact that the shoreline will want to forever migrate inland. We need to come up with new architectural forms that can adapt to rising sea level. In some places, floating structures may be appropriate. In other, buildings designed to last for only a short period of time may work. Structures that can be disassembled, moved, and reassembled are worthy of consideration. Now, unfortunately, a lot of our existing laws and regulations that were enacted back before climate change was an issue and we thought the shoreline didn't move will make it difficult, if not impossible, to authorize, to permit these structures that are resilient to rising sea level. Because our rules say on this side of the shoreline you can do one thing, on the other side you can't do something else, and if the shoreline moves, we don't have rules that apply. So after we figure out what resilient shoreline development looks like, we're going to have to reverse engineer our laws to make it possible to permit those structures. Along some parts of the shoreline, we can take advantage of the fact that wetlands are about as close to magic as you're going to get when you deal with flood protection. They soak up flood water and they absorb wind energy. So the wider the wetland in the front, the lower the levee can be in the back, and as a result, it's less costly to build levees if they're built inland of wetlands. So wetland restoration and a new concept called a horizontal levee can be part of our overall regional flood protection strategy. Along other parts of the shoreline, seawalls and other engineering solutions will be appropriate. Now, in trying to decide which is the best way to deal with rising sea level, it's helpful to remember this observation by H.L. Mencken. There is no one right answer. Therefore, the best regional planning approach for addressing rising sea level will be much like triage in a medical emergency. We'll have to decide which areas should be protected, where we should restore wetlands, where we should build innovative new types of development, and where we should retreat from the waterfront. And just as in medicine, making these policy decisions won't be easy. The journalist Mark Hertsgaard, a friend from here in the Bay Area, who's written a terrific book called Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth, says that there are two related actions that must be taken to successfully address climate change. The first is to move as quickly as we can to reduce greenhouse gases, to avoid the unmanageable. A carbon tax is the next best thing we have to an emergency shut-off button. At the same time, we need to begin to manage the unavoidable by adapting to the climate change impacts like sea level rise that are inevitable. Developing a regional strategy for adapting to rising sea level, it won't be cheap, fast, or easy. But the goal for dealing with climate change as our region's most defining economic imperative can be quite simple. We want this headline to appear in the newspaper 50 years from now. Thank you for your time. If there are any questions, one of the scientists will be happy to answer them.
We can do five minutes of questions.
That'll exhaust all the time for all information.
My question is sort of controversial, and that is, with sea level rise and the loss of the polar ice cap, there's been discussion for probably 3 or 4 decades about the option of they call it climate engineering, of putting sulfates in the outer atmosphere. And it looks like it's something that the Chinese might do. The cost is less than the cost of a nuclear reactor. If that were to be done, how would that impact sea level rise? If they were to put 500,000 tons of sulfates in the outer atmosphere, would that cooling of the Earth be enough to stop sea level rise?
Well, as I said, you're going to have to very quickly reverse all of the greenhouse gases that have gone into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Frankly, I don't want to be in the test tube while they're running that experiment.
Right. But if there's no choice, I don't think there would be a choice. There is a choice.
Well, as the journalist Molly Ivins used to say, the first rule of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. So I think the most prudent thing to do is, if we have too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere now, we ought to stop putting any more in. And that's why a carbon tax, or a carbon fee and dividend, as I learned was the appropriate term last night, seems like even the brain dead ought to be able to figure that out. And then if we want to run wacko geoengineering experiments, which maybe because we're running this experiment now, where we're trying to see how fast we can get all of the carbon out of the ground that took billions of years to get in there, and we're in the test tube, maybe we want to run another one, but I would prefer not to be part of it.
I just want to re-comment that there was an article recently in the New York Times talking about how if there was a massive reforestation program, it would absorb a lot of the carbon.
Well, okay, folks, here's a simple way of looking at this. If you look at CO2, and you look at temperature, and you look at sea level over the past 500,000 years, that's from when my mother was little, essentially they track together, and for every degree Fahrenheit change in the global average temperature, sea level goes up or down 35 feet. Over the past century, the average global temperature of the oceans has increased 1.5 degrees. So there's 50 feet of sea level rise baked into the system now. Now, it may take hundreds or thousands of years to reach that equilibrium, but I think it will be very difficult to do anything that will take that 1.5 degrees and reverse it in a time span that would markedly solve the problem. So that's why I think adaptation is, if we can think about it and come up with innovative new ways of doing it, it's on a long-term basis. It's like going down to the shoreline and you build a sandcastle, full well knowing that when the tide comes in, that sandcastle's going to go away, but you can enjoy it. We can do that on a longer basis by building communities along the shoreline, full well realizing that they may not be around for our grandchildren, but we can make productive use of the land and the shoreline and still go on and continue to adapt.
And we have things to go on to.